平和運動であったという意味で非常に大きな意義を持っているということができます。
March 1st, 1919, hundreds of Korean citizens, mostly students and Christians, gathered within the area of Pagoda Park to hear the reading of the Korean Declaration for Independence, written by Choi Nam-son and Mane. This demonstration at Pagoda Park was the first incidence of revolution by the people of Korea in response to Japanese occupation and rule. It led to more demonstrations and, although initially unsuccessful, the eventual reform by the Japanese. (1386) The Ming Dynasty took over Korea and kept control until the Qing Dynasty replaced it in 1644. 1876. Korea was forced into signing the unequal Treaty of Ganghwa, which permanently opened up 3 Korean ports for trade with Japan. 1884. Koreans struggling for independence split into 2 groups, half wanting support from China and the other half from Japan. This rebellion was named the Gapshinku and was put down by Chinese troops. 1894. Peasants revolt in the Donghak Revolution, which changed Japanese policy towards Korea because the Koreans had negotiated with Russia to counterbalance Japanese power. Soon China sent in their troops, and Japan responded with force. 1895. Japan defeated China. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed, granting the full and complete independence and autonomy of Korea. This officially ended Qing control of Korea. 1905 to 1910. Several treaties were signed between Japan and outside nations recognizing Japan's interests in Korea. 1910, August 22nd, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed by Lee Won-young, giving Japan control of Korea. Korea had been ruled by the Chinese for over 500 years prior to their liberation. The people now experienced freedom and independence, only to have it taken away by the Japanese 15 years later. This was an underhanded betrayal by the Japanese because they had been the ones who had assisted Korea in gaining their independence from China. Once Lee Won-young signed the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty, Japan was able to move into Korea and slowly replace Korea's political, educational, religious, and social policies with their own, greatly changing the way of life for Korean citizens. Some of these changes included stripping the emperor of his power in favor of ruling through a governor-general who was loyal to the Japanese prime minister, all of which were high-ranking Japanese military officers. Another change was that the Korean educational curriculum was replaced with an improved Japanese one. All students were forced to learn Japanese, and classes that would promote Korean nationalism were cut. Originally, the Koreans were to be treated as Japanese citizens. Though good in theory, this never became a reality, and it was soon clear that the Koreans would never rise above the status of conquered people. They were not allowed to be part of the government unless they were undisputedly loyal to the Japanese prime minister. They were not allowed to publish any newspaper or informative printed media, and the Japanese ultimately attempted to condition them to forget their national identity as united Koreans. Although there were no major events that occurred in the years between Japan taking over and the March 1st movement itself, tensions between the Korean people and their Japanese rulers began to build. At 2 p.m. on March 1st, 1919, the 33 nationalists who formed the core of the March 1st movement, known in Korea as the Samyeol-undong, met at Taehangwan Restaurant and read and signed the Korean Declaration of Independence. These nationalists then sent the document to the chief administrator of the Japanese government and called the police and informed them of what they had done. They were immediately arrested. Soon after, a copy of this declaration was brought to Pagoda Park and read aloud by a student, Chun Jae-young, to a large crowd of Korean activists. These demonstrators were shot, killed, wounded, and arrested by Japanese military officers. This first uprising at Pagoda Park paved the way for more demonstrations spread throughout the country and abroad.
Just didn't appreciate what Japan was doing for them. But the leaders in Japan were very embarrassed by this because they had been telling the world that the Korean people loved them and the Korean people appreciated everything that Japan was doing, and this showed the world the truth that Koreans didn't like Japan and didn't like what Japan was doing in Korea.
Yu Guan-soon was one of the most famous demonstrators during the March 1st movement, even though she was only 16 years old at the time. She led one of the most powerful demonstrations following the initial one in Pagoda Park. Shortly after March 1st, Yu Guan-soon organized a group of students to form a large demonstration in Awane Marketplace. To gather supporters, she contacted everyone in her hometown and the surrounding areas. The day of the demonstration, Yu Guan-soon personally carried a torch up a mountain near Chonan, signaling the start of the demonstration. It did not take the police long to come and suppress the movement. They mercilessly opened fire into a defenseless crowd, killing several and wounding many others. Both of Yu Guan-soon's parents were shot and she was arrested. However, she did not give up and she continued to protest in prison despite continual torture until her death in December 1920.
My fingernails may fall off, my nose and ears cut off, my hands and legs broken, I can bear the pain. But the pain of losing my country I cannot bear. That I only have one life to give for my country, it is my only sadness.
Because the Japanese were taken completely by surprise and really didn't know how to handle this massive protest, and so they pretty much overreacted.
볼 수 있기만 아냐 나를 바라봐 아냐 내 곁에 있어줘.
After the March 1st movement, the Japanese were more lenient on the Koreans as many reforms took place. One such reform was a civilian force replaced the military police and a limited form of press freedom was allowed. In addition, Korean officials were given the same salaries as Japanese officials, and Korean and Japanese judges were given similar powers. Along with these reforms, the Korean provisional governments were established in Seoul, Shanghai, and Vladivostok, which continue to fight for a complete independence from Japan.
The trains, for example, run on the left-hand side, just like in Japan, although the cars go on the right like we do. There are a lot of Japanese restaurants. Elderly people can speak Japanese.
Today, the tensions between Korea and Japan are insignificant in comparison to what they were during the 1900s. South Korean pop culture has become popular in Japan. One television series, Winter Sonata, became greatly popular in Japan, and others had both Korean and Japanese versions created. For example, Hanayori Dango was created in Japan and was later recreated in Korea and called Boys Over Flowers. Even the music industry has adapted to this change. Many Korean pop idols made their debuts in Japan and continued to tour there and create Japanese versions of their songs. Recently, many artists traveled to Japan following the devastating earthquake to hold relief concerts and donate money. They truly wanted to support their Japanese fans and others in their time of need. However, one of the most significant reminders of the March 1st movement is the annual celebration that occurs on March 1st commemorating this historic event in which shouts of Manse fill the streets. Manse was on the lips of all March 1st demonstrators and is still proclaimed by Korean citizens celebrating this movement.